Part 1. The Storm Brewing in Salonica, 1881 to 1893.
So, pull up a chair and let's get into it. To understand Mustafa Kemal, you have to understand the world he was born into. It's 1881. The Ottoman Empire is, frankly, a mess. People called it the sick man of Europe. But it was more like a giant, ancient house that hadn't been repaired in 300 years. The roof was leaking, the walls were cracking, and the neighbors, the great powers like Britain, Russia, and France, were just sitting on a lawn with chainsaws, waiting for the whole thing to collapse so they could grab the lumber. In the middle of this chaos, there's a city called Salonica. Now, forget what you know about modern borders. Back then, Salonica was the beating heart of the Balkans. It was loud, it was salty, it was crowded, and it was brilliant. You had Jews, Greeks, Turks, Bulgarians, and Serbs all living on top of each other. It was the Paris of the East. If a new idea started in Europe, democracy, science, revolution, it hit the docks of Salonica first. In a 3-story pink house on a cobblestone street, a kid is born. His name is Mustafa. Mustafa's parents are the first battle of his life. You've got his dad, Rıza Efendi. He was a modern guy, a customs official turned timber merchant who wore a Western-style fez and believed in progress. Then you've got his mom, Zubayd Hanım. She was a powerhouse, deeply religious, traditional, and tough as nails. The first big conflict in Mustafa's life wasn't a war. It was about which school he should go to. Zubayd wanted him to go to the local religious school, the Mahal Mektebi, to learn prayers and tradition. Ali Reza wanted him to go to the Semsi Effendi school, which was super modern for the time. They had desks, maps, and new teaching methods. They fought about it. But Ali Reza was a diplomat. He let Mustafa start at the religious school with all the fancy ceremonies to make Zubayd happy, then transferred him to the modern school a few days later. Even as a tiny kid, Mustafa was picking up on this. The world was split between the old ways and the new ways, and he was firmly on the side of the new. But then, tragedy hits. Hard. Ali Reza's business fails, his health tanks, and he dies when Mustafa is just 7 years old. Imagine that. The modern influence his life is gone. Zubayd, now a widow with no income, takes her kids and moves to her brother's farm in the countryside, a place called Langaza. This is where the legend usually tells the crow-chasing story. People treat it like a cute little anecdote, but think about it deeply. Mustafa goes from the most cosmopolitan city in the empire to a muddy farm in the middle of nowhere. He's out there in the fields, under the sun, literally fighting off crows to protect the crops. He's lonely, he's isolated, but this is where his grit comes from. He's not playing with toys. He's taking on responsibility. He's watching the horizon. He's realizing that if you want something to stay standing, you have to defend it. But after a while, the farm isn't enough. There's a fire in this kid that a farm can't put out. He misses the books. He misses the city. He eventually convinces his mom to let him go back to Salonica to stay with his aunt and finish school. Now, here's the turning point. Mustafa is a teenager, and he sees the military officers walking the streets in the Ottoman Empire. If you were smart but poor, the military was your only elevator to the top. It wasn't just about fighting. The military academies were the only places teaching real science, math, and philosophy. Mustafa decides he's going to be an officer. Zubayd says, no way. She's terrified of losing her only son to a war. So, what does a 12-year-old Mustafa do? He goes behind her back. He studies in secret. He takes the entrance exam for the military middle school, Rustai, without telling a soul. He passes with flying colors. By the time Zubayd finds out, he's already got his uniform. He presented her with a fait accompli, a move he'd use many times later against the British and the Greeks. At the military school, he's a shark. He's focused, he's disciplined, and he's incredibly good at math. He's so good that his math teacher, a guy also named Mustafa, looks at him one day and says, "Look, kid, we both have the same name. There has to be a difference between us. From now on, your name is Mustafa Kemal. Kemal means perfection. It's a heavy name for a 13-year-old. But Mustafa Kemal didn't shy away from it. He embraced it. He started staying up late, reading things that weren't on the syllabus. He was a bit of a loner. He didn't care about the petty games the other kids played. He was looking at a bigger picture. He was watching the empire bleed. He was watching the borders shrink. And in his little dorm room, this blue-eyed kid was already starting to wonder, if the Sultan can't save this house, who will? He didn't know it yet, but the answer was looking back at him in the mirror. He was done with the Mahal Mektibi world. He was a soldier of the New Age now. And the next stop was Manastir, the city of consuls, where his mind would truly catch fire.
Part 2. Poetry, Rebellion, and the Big Apple, 1896 to 1905.
So it's 1896. Mustafa Kemal is a teenager, 15 years old, and he leaves Salonica for the Manastir Military High School. Now, Manastir, modern-day Bitolia in North Macedonia, wasn't some sleepy school town. It was the city of consuls. It was a den of spies, diplomats, and revolutionaries from every corner of the Balkans. If Salonica was a port where ideas landed, Manastir was a laboratory where they were turned into bombs. The school itself was beautiful, but the atmosphere, it was tense. You had Serbian, Bulgarian, and Greek rebels running around the mountains nearby. And every student in that school knew the Ottoman Empire was holding on by a thread. The poet and the rebel. This is where Mustafa Kemal meets a guy who would change his life. Omar Nasi. Now, Mustafa was a math whiz. He liked logic, clean lines, and hard facts. But Omar Nasi, he was a romantic. He was into poetry, literature, and eloquence. He looked at Mustafa and said, "Look, kid, you're smart, but you've got no soul in your speech. You need to read the poets." Mustafa started devouring the works of Namik Kemal, the poet of liberty. Now, you gotta understand, reading Namik Kemal back then was like having a banned substance. If the Sultan's spies caught you with his books, you were in deep trouble. Namik Kemal talked about Vatan, motherland, and Hurriyet, freedom. These weren't just words. They were grenades. Mustafa would stay up late, whispering these poems with his friends in the dorms, feeling his heart race. He realized that being a soldier wasn't just about shooting straight. It was about having a reason to shoot. The French Connection. But he didn't stop at Turkish poetry. He realized that if he wanted to understand how the modern world worked, he had to learn French. Why? Because French was the language of the Enlightenment. It was the language of the people who cut off their king's head and talked about the rights of man. He spent his summers back in Salonica taking extra French lessons. He started reading Rousseau, Voltaire, and Montesquieu. Imagine this teenager sitting in a cafe, reading The Social Contract while the Ottoman secret police are literally at the next table. He was absorbing the idea that power doesn't come from a sultan or God. It comes from the people. That was mind-blowing stuff for a kid in a monarchy. The kid who wanted to fight. In 1897, when he was just 16, the Greco-Turkish War broke out. Mustafa Kemal and his buddies did exactly what you'd expect a bunch of fired-up teenagers to do. They tried to run away from school to join the army. They didn't make it. They got caught, but it showed where his head was at. The Ottomans actually won that war on the battlefield. But at the peace table, the great powers stepped in and basically gave the Greeks everything they wanted anyway. Mustafa watched this and realized a bitter truth. Winning a war doesn't mean anything if your politicians are weak. That lesson would stay with him forever. Elena, the what-if story. Now, we gotta talk about Elena Karemenov. History is a bit blurry here, but the legend goes that while he was in Manchester, he fell for a beautiful Greek girl. Her dad was a wealthy merchant and, obviously, he wasn't about to let his daughter marry a Turkish military student. The story goes that they tried to elope, her dad locked her up, and they never saw each other again. There's even a love letter from Elena to Mustafa Kemal that people still talk about in Bitoya. Whether every detail is 100% true or not, it shows the human side of the man. He wasn't a robot. He felt the sting of the world's divisions personally. Moving to the Big Apple, Istanbul, in 1899, he graduates from Manchester and gets into the War Academy, Harbi, in Istanbul. If you think New York is big, 1899 Istanbul was the center of the universe. It was the capital of a three-continent empire. It was grand, crumbling, mysterious, and dangerous. Mustafa Kemal arrives as a young cadet, and he is overwhelmed. He sees the Sultan's massive palaces, the poverty in the back streets, and the foreign embassies that seemed to have more power than the government. He and his friends started a secret society. They'd meet in a rented room, drink tea and probably some raki, and talk about how to fix the empire. They even started a handwritten newspaper. Mustafa Kemal was the editor. He was writing articles about the sick man of Europe and how the only cure was a revolution. Think about the risk here. One snitch, one slip-up, and he'd be sent to a dungeon in the middle of the desert. He was playing a high-stakes game. He graduates as a captain in 1905. He's 24 years old. He's sharp, he's educated, and he's dangerous. The Sultan's spies have been watching him. Instead of fancy posts in the capital, they gave him a one-way ticket to Damascus. It was basically a legal exile. They wanted him away from the action. But as we discussed before, sending Mustafa Kemal away was like trying to put out a fire by throwing it into a dry forest. Damascus was just the beginning of his real-world education.
Part 3. The Desert, the Spies, and the Eye of the Storm, 1905 to 1911.
So, we left off with Mustafa Kemal graduating as a staff captain in 1905. Now, usually if you're at the top of your class, you get a cushy job in the capital. But the Sultan's secret police, the Hafi, were already breathing down his neck. They caught wind of his secret newspapers and his dangerous talk about democracy. They actually arrested him right after graduation. They threw him in a cell for a few weeks, let him sweat it out, and then basically said, "Look, we could execute you, or we could send you to the middle of nowhere." They chose the second option. They sent him to Damascus, Syria, the Damascus exile. Damascus back then was a tough post. It was the edge of the empire, full of tribal rebellions and chaos. The Sultan thought, he'll be so busy chasing bandits in the desert that he'll forget all about the Enlightenment. Wrong again. Mustafa Kemal gets to Damascus and realizes the soldiers there are hungry, the equipment is trash, and the local government is corrupt to the bone. Instead of getting depressed, he gets organized. He meets a few like-minded officers and a doctor who've been exiled there, and they start a secret society called Vaten v. Harit, Motherland and Liberty. Think about the guts this took. He's a young officer in an army full of spies, and he's setting up a revolutionary cell. He even goes on a secret, unauthorized trip to Jaffa and Salonica, sneaking across borders like a ghost, just to set more chapters of a society. He was building a network while the Sultan's guys were literally looking for him. The 1908 revolution, bittersweet victory. By 1907, he manages to get transferred back to his hometown, Salonica. By now, the revolutionary vibe is everywhere. The Young Turks, a group called the Committee of Union and Progress Cup, were ready to blow. In 1908, it finally happens. The revolution. The Sultan is forced to bring back the Constitution. People are dancing in the streets. Turks, Greeks, Jews, and Bulgarians are hugging each other, crying freedom. But Mustafa Kemal, he wasn't dancing. He looked at the leaders of the revolution, guys like Enver Pasha, who was his rival and polar opposite, and he saw trouble. Enver was a big-picture guy who loved the spotlight and dreamed of glory. Mustafa Kemal was a details guy who cared about the foundation. He told them straight to their faces, soldiers should stay out of politics. If we don't take off our uniforms before we enter the assembly, we're going to destroy the army and the country. Nobody wanted to hear that. They called him a killjoy. They sidelined him. While Enver was becoming a superstar, Mustafa Kemal was sent to the background to handle boring stuff like military training and logistics. But man, he used that time. He wrote manuals. He studied the German military system. He was sharpening his mind while the others were enjoying the party. The Tripoli Gamble 1911. Then, out of nowhere, Italy decides it wants a piece of North Africa. They invade Tripoli, modern-day Libya, which was still an Ottoman territory. The empire was in no shape to fight. The navy was a joke, and the British, who controlled Egypt, wouldn't let the Ottoman army march through. The government in Istanbul basically said, sorry, Tripoli, you're on your own. Mustafa Kemal couldn't stand that. He and Enver, yes, the rivals teamed up for this. decided to go anyway. They went undercover. Mustafa Kemal dressed up as a journalist named Sharif. He traveled through Egypt, dodging British patrols, and eventually made it into the desert. Imagine this guy. He's a high-ranking staff officer, and he's living in a tent in the middle of the Sahara, drinking tea with local Bedouin leaders. Try convince them to fight the Italians. He didn't have a modern army. He had guys on horses with old rifles. But he made it work. He organized them into a guerrilla force that drove Italians crazy. At the Battle of Tobruk, he actually beat a modern European force with a bunch of desert warriors. This is also where he got that famous look in his eyes during a bombardment at Dern. A piece of limestone shrapnel hit him in the eye. It bled like crazy. He didn't have a doctor, so he just kept fighting. That I would never be quite the same. It gave him this piercing, slightly fixed stare that made people feel like he was looking right through their souls. He was out there for a year, bleeding in the sand, winning battles that nobody in Istanbul even cared about. But then the phone rang, or rather, the telegraph beeped. The Balkans were exploding. The sick man was about to get stabbed in the heart, and Mustafa Kemal had to leave the desert to go save his own home. He left Libya as a seasoned warrior, but the nightmare he was heading into was something no one could prepare for.
Part 4. The Balkan Disaster and the Tuxedo Years, 1912 to 1914.
So, Mustafa Kemal is out there in the Libyan desert, right? He's basically playing Lawrence of Arabia before Lawrence was even a thing. But then, the news hits the telegraph. The Balkan Wars have started. For small countries, Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia, and Montenegro, all teamed up to kick the Ottomans out of Europe. This wasn't just another war. This was a total shit show. Mustafa Kemal rushes back, but by the time he gets a front, it's already a disaster. The Ottoman army, the same one he'd warned about being too involved in politics, was falling apart. Generals weren't talking to each other because they belonged to different political parties. It was embarrassing. The Bulgarians almost reached Istanbul. But the real gut punch? Salonica fell. Think about that. His hometown, the place where he was born, where he went to school, where his mother lived. Gone, just like that. His mom and sister had to flee as refugees, packed onto a boat like sardines, ending up in a tiny house in Istanbul. Mustafa Kemal was furious. He saw the big bosses in Istanbul, guys like Enver Pasha, running the war like a hobby. He realized that the empire didn't just need a new general. It needed a whole new soul. The golden exile in Sofia. After the Balkan mess settled down, the government wanted to keep him away from the capital again. He was too loud, too critical, and frankly, too smart for them. So they sent him to Sofia, Bulgaria, as a military attaché. On paper, it was a boring diplomatic job. He had to wear a tuxedo, go to operas, and eat fancy dinners with ambassadors. But Mustafa Kemal used this time like a spy. He watched how the Bulgarians, who had been Ottoman subjects just a few decades ago, had built a modern, working state. He saw their schools, their theaters, their parliament. He was taking notes. He was thinking, if they can do it, why can't we? There's this famous story about a costume ball in Sofia. All the European diplomats were there in their fancy modern suits. Mustafa Kemal shows up in a traditional Janissary uniform, the elite soldiers of the old Ottoman glory days. He walked into that room like a rock star. It was a message: we might be down, but we haven't forgotten who we are. He won the prize for the best costume, obviously, but underneath the velvet and the sword, he was heartbroken because he knew the real Ottoman army was a shadow of its former self. The train wreck called World War I. Then came 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand gets assassinated in Sarajevo, and the whole world decides to commit collective suicide. Mustafa Kemal saw it coming. He watched the alliance between Germany and the Ottomans getting tighter and tighter, and he screamed at the top of his lungs, "Don't do it!" He wrote reports from Sofia, telling the leaders in Istanbul, Germany is going to lose. The British and the French have too many resources. If we join this war, we're going to get liquidated. But Enver Pasha was obsessed with the Germans. He thought the Kaiser was the ticket to rebuilding the empire. He secretly signed a deal, and before anyone knew it, German warships with Ottoman flags were bombing Russian ports. The Ottomans were officially in World War I. Mustafa Kemal was devastated. He hated the decision, but he was a soldier. He wrote a letter to his bosses. "I want an active command. If my country is going to burn, I want to be in the fire." They tried to ignore him. They tried to give him a desk job. But eventually, the British and the French started eyeing a tiny, rocky strip of land called the Gallipoli Peninsula. The Allies thought they could just sail through, take Istanbul, and end the war in a week. The government finally gave Mustafa Kemal a command, the 19th Division. It was a new, unorganized unit in a place they thought was quiet. They sent him to Gallipoli basically to get him out of the way. They had no idea they had just put the only man who could stop the British Empire exactly where he needed to be. The stage was set. The stakes were everything. And the world was about to find out that Mustafa Kemal wasn't just a name. It was a force of nature.
Part 5. The Lion of Gallipoli, 1915 to 1916.
So, picture the scene. The British and the French are tired of the stalemate in the Western Front. Winston Churchill, yeah, that guy has this brilliant idea. He thinks, if we sail our massive battleships through the Dardanelles, we can knock the Ottomans out, grab Istanbul, and open a supply line to Russia. It'll be over by lunch. They call the Ottomans low-level fighters. They thought they'd just see the British flags and run away. They had no idea they were about to hit a wall of pure, unadulterated grit. The man who saw the future. Mustafa Kemal was a lieutenant colonel at the time. He was in charge of the 19th Division, which was basically the reserve force. He wasn't a guy in charge of the whole peninsula. That was a German general named Lyman von Sanders. Sanders thought the British would land in one place. Mustafa Kemal, who had literally walked every inch of those hills during the Balkan Wars, knew they'd land somewhere else. On the morning of April 25, 1915, the Anzacs, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, landed at what is now called Anzac Cove. They were in the wrong spot, staring up at these vertical, jagged cliffs, but they started climbing. Mustafa Kemal didn't wait for orders. He heard the sound of guns, and his spider sense went off. He realized that if the enemy took the high ground at Conquebiri, the war was over in an hour. He marched his men through the scrub, uphill, at a pace that should have been impossible. I order you to die. He gets to the top of the ridge and sees a bunch of Ottoman soldiers running away. They're panicked. They're out of ammo. Mustafa Kemal stands in their path, alone, and screams, "Why are you running?" "Sir, the enemy," they shout. "We have no bullets." Mustafa Kemal doesn't blink. He says, "If you have no bullets, you have your bayonets. Lie down." When they hit the dirt, the Anzac stopped. They thought it was an ambush. That tiny hesitation changed history. It gave his reinforcements time to arrive. This is when he gave the order that still makes people shiver. "I do not order you to attack. I order you to die. In the time it takes for us to die, other troops and commanders can come and take our places." Think about that for a second. That's not a speech from a movie. That's a man looking at his soldiers and saying, "We are the sacrifice." And the crazy part? They did it. They held that ridge. The 57th Regiment was wiped out almost to the last man, but they never broke. The Battle of the Inches. For the next few months, Gallipoli turned into a nightmare. It was trench warfare, but on steroids. In some places, the Turkish and British trenches were only 8 or 10 yards apart. You could hear the guy on the other side snoring. You could smell his tobacco. Mustafa Kemal lived in a dugout. He was covered in dust. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, and he was smoking like a chimney. But he was everywhere. He wasn't sitting in a palace in Istanbul. He was in the dirt with his Mehmets, the nickname for Turkish soldiers. He ate what they ate, mostly dry bread and a bit of soup. The miracle of the pocket watch. In August, the British tried one last massive push at Anafartalar. Mustafa Kemal had been promoted to colonel by then, and he was basically running the show. During a crazy bayonet charge at Conquebiri, a piece of shrapnel flew out of the smoke and hit him right in the chest. It should have been the end, but the metal hit the silver pocket watch in his breast pocket. The watch shattered into a million pieces, but it absorbed the impact. He had a massive bruise, but he stayed on his feet. He gave the shattered watch to Lyman Vaughn Sanders later as a souvenir. He didn't care about the brush with death. He cared about the ridge, and he held it, the ghost of the peninsula. By January 1916, the British realized they'd made a catastrophic mistake. They'd lost 250,000 men. The Ottomans had lost just as many. It was a massacre. The Allies snuck away in the night, leaving behind their equipment and their dead. Mustafa Kemal emerged from the smoke as a national hero. The newspapers in Istanbul called him the hero of Anafartalar. While every other Ottoman general was losing ground in the Caucasus or Iraq, he was a guy who had beaten the invincible British Empire. But here's the kicker. Even after saving the capital, the big bosses in Istanbul were still jealous of him. They didn't want a hero, they wanted a puppet. So they sent him away again, this time to the Eastern Front to fight the Russians in the snow. Gallipoli didn't just win a battle. It gave the Turkish people a face. For the first time, They had a leader who didn't just command, he inspired. He'd proven that a peasant from Anatolia could take on the world's superpowers and win. The sick man had one hell of a bite, and Mustafa Kemal was the teeth.
Part 6. The Ghost in the Bosphorus and the Final Stand, 1916 to 1918.
So, Gallipoli is in the rear-view mirror, and Mustafa Kemal is officially the hero of Anafardalar. But in the snake pit of Istanbul politics, being a hero is a dangerous business. Enver Pasha and the rest of the Big Three looked at this blue-eyed colonel and didn't see a savior. They saw a threat. They couldn't fire him because the people loved him, so they did the next best thing. They buried him in the mountains. They promoted him to general, made him a pasha at the age of 35, and shipped him off to the Eastern Front to fight the Russians in the Caucasus. Now, imagine going from the heat and dust of the Mediterranean trenches to a place where the snow doesn't melt until July. The Ottoman army in the East was a ghost of an army. They were starving. Their boots were literal rags. And they were facing a Russian steamroller. Most generals would have just sat in a tent and waited for the end. But Mustafa Kemal goes into high gear. He doesn't start with a battle plan. He starts with the bread. He realizes a soldier who hasn't eaten in 3 days isn't going to hold a mountain pass. He fixes the supply lines. He kicks the corrupt quartermasters in the teeth, and he gets his men fed. Then, in the middle of a brutal winter, he launches a counteroffensive that catches the Russians totally flat-footed. He actually retakes the cities of Mus and Bitlis. It was a miracle. While the Ottoman Empire was losing ground everywhere else, Mustafa Kemal was the only one handing back keys to stolen cities. But the war was taking its toll. He got sick, kidney issues that would haunt him for years, and he was sent to Carlsbad in Europe to recover. While he was there, he lived like a modern European intellectual, reading, thinking, and watching the world fall apart. It was during this time he was told to accompany the crown prince, Vahdettin, on a trip to Germany. This is a crucial moment, man. He's on a train with the future sultan, heading to meet the German Kaiser and the top generals like Hindenburg and Ludendorff. Mustafa Kemal wasn't there to be a tourist. During dinners with the German High Command, while everyone else was kissing up to the Kaiser, Mustafa Kemal was the annoying guy in the room. He'd look at their maps and tell them straight to their faces, "You're losing. You think you're winning, but your lines are too thin and your people are starving. If you go down, you're taking us with you." The Germans thought he was arrogant. Vahdettin thought he was embarrassing. But Mustafa Kemal wasn't being rude. He was being a realist. He spent that whole trip studying Vahdettin, too. He realized the future sultan was a man with no spine, a man who would fold the second a British officer looked at him funny. He realized right then that the Ottoman dynasty was a dead end. If the Turks were going to survive, they couldn't rely on a king who was more afraid of his own shadow than the enemy. By 1918, the writing was on the wall. The empire was collapsing. He gets sent back to the Palestinian front to take over the 7th Army. It was a nightmare scenario. The British General Allenby had modern tanks, planes, and a massive cavalry. The Ottoman lines were basically held together by spit and prayer. Mustafa Kemal arrives and realizes his fellow commanders are living in a fantasy land. They wanted to hold every inch of the desert. Mustafa Kemal said, "Forget the desert. We're losing the sand to save the home." He made a cold tactical decision that made him even more enemies in Istanbul. He pulled his troops back. He wasn't running. He was consolidating. He fought a brilliant rearguard action all the way back to the north of Aleppo. He basically drew a line on the map and said, "This is where the Turkish heartland begins. From here on, we don't move." He held that line against the British until the day the Armistice of Mudros was signed on October 30th, 1918. The war was over. The Empire had lost. He takes a long, slow train ride back to Istanbul. He arrives at the Haydarpasa station on November 13th, 1918. It's a gray, miserable day. He steps off the train and walks to the pier to cross the Bosphorus. He looks out at the water, and his heart must have just dropped. There they were, 61 Allied warships, British battleships, French cruisers, Greek destroyers. Their cannons were pointed right at the Sultan's palace. The city he'd fought his whole life to protect was now an occupied camp. Foreign soldiers were walking the streets of Istanbul like they owned the place. His aide-de-camp, Chevatabaz, was standing next to him, and the guy just couldn't take it. He started sobbing. He looked at the fleet and said, "It's over, Pasha. We fought for nothing. Everything is gone." Mustafa Kemal didn't look away. He didn't cry. He just reached into his pocket, pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and squinted through the smoke at those massive steel ships. He said 5 words that sounded like a curse and a prophecy all at once. "Geldikleri gibi giderler. De vil gåas dikem. Abbastottu pashahat finalisnep. Haukaul digo. The Turks had no army left. The Sultan was a puppet, and the British were the masters of the world. But Mustafa Kemal wasn't looking at the ships anymore. He was looking past them, toward the mountains of Anatolia. He knew Istanbul was a golden cage. He knew the Sultan vowed to make a deal to save his own skin. He knew that the only way to win was to go to the people, to the farmers, the peasants, and the soldiers who had nothing left to lose. He stayed in Istanbul for 6 months, playing the game, meeting with British officers, making the Sultan's government think he was just another out-of-work general. But in the middle of the night, in quiet house in the back streets of the city, he was meeting with the black sheep, the guys who were ready to start a fire. He was waiting for his chance to get out. He was waiting for the moment he called home from the sinking ship of the empire onto the solid rock of the nation. And man, when the chance finally came, he didn't just take it. He tore the doors of the hinges.